Talk. Junction with the Liberals. 1859.
Conviction, in spite of early associations and long-cherished prepossessions, strong conviction, and an overpowering sense of the public interests operating for many, many years before full effect was given to it, placed me in the ranks of the Liberal Party. Gladstone, Ormskirk, 1867. When Mr. Gladstone returned to England in March 1859, he found the Conservatives with much ineffectual industry, some misplaced ingenuity, and many misgivings and divisions, trying their hands at parliamentary reform. Their infringement of what passed for a Liberal patent was not turning out well. Convulsions in the cabinet, murmurs in the lobbies, resistance from the opposite benches, all showed that a ministry existing on sufferance would not at that stage be allowed to settle the question.
In this contest, Mr. Gladstone did not actively join.
Speaking from the ministerial side of the House, he made a fervid defense of nomination boroughs as the nurseries of statesmen, but he voted with ministers against a Whig amendment. His desire, he said, was to settle the question as soon as possible, always, however, on the foundation of trust in the people, that sound and satisfactory basis on which for several years past legislation had been proceeding. The hostile amendment was carried against ministers by statesmen irreconcilably at variance with one another, alike in principle and object. The majority of 39 was very large for those days, and it was decisive. Though the Parliament was little more than a couple of years old, yet in face of the desperate confusion among leaders, parties, and groups, and upon the plea that reform had not been formally submitted as an issue to the country, Lord Derby felt justified in dissolving.
Mr. Gladstone held the Oxford seat without opposition.
The constituencies displayed an extension of the same essentially conservative feeling that had given Lord Palmerston the victory 2 years before. Once more the real question lay not so much between measures as men, not so much between democratic change and conservative moderation, as between Palmerston and Russell on the one hand, and Derby and Disraeli on the other.
The government at the election improved their position by some 30 votes. This was not enough to outnumber the phalanx of their various opponents combined, but was it possible that the phalanx should combine?
Mr. Gladstone, who spoke of the dissolution as being a most improper as well as a most important measure, alike in domestic and in foreign bearings, told Acland that he would not be surprised if the government were to attempt some reconstruction on a broad basis before the new Parliament met. This course was not adopted.
Critical moments.
The chances of turning out the government were matters of infinite computation among the leaders. The Liberal whip after the election gave his own party a majority of 15, but the Treasury whip, on the other hand, was equally confident of a majority of 10.
Still, all was admittedly uncertain.
The prime perplexity was whether, if a new administration could be formed, Lord Palmerston or Lord John should be at its head. Everybody agreed that it would be both impossible and wrong to depose the Tories until it was certain that the Liberals were united enough to mount into their seat, and no government could last unless it comprehended both the old Prime Ministers.
Could not one of them carry the prize of the premiership into the Lords, and leave to the other the consolation stake of leadership in the Commons?
Lord Palmerston, who took the crisis with a veteran's good-humoured coolness, told his intimates that he at any rate would not go up to the Lords, for he could not trust John Russell in the other House. With a view, however, to ministerial efficiency, he was anxious to keep Russell in the Commons, as with him and Gladstone they would make a strong Treasury bench.
But was it certain that Gladstone would join?
On this there was endless gossip. One story ran that Mrs. Gladstone had told somebody that her husband wished bygones to be bygones, was all for a strong government, and was ready to join in forming one. Then the personage to whom this was said upset the inference by declaring there was nothing in the conversation incompatible with a Derby junction. Sir Charles Wood says in his journal, May 22 saw Mrs. Gladstone, who did not seem to contemplate a junction with Palmerston but rather that he should join Derby. I stated the impossibility of that, and that the strongest government possible under present circumstances would be by such a union as took place under Aberdeen.
To effect this, all people must pull the same and not different ways as of late years. I said that I blamed her husband for quitting, and ever since he quitted Palmerston's government in 1855, as well as Lord John, that in the quarrel between Lord John and Gladstone the former had behaved ill, and the latter well. May 27. Gladstone dined here. He would vote a condemnation of the dissolution, and is afraid of the foreign affairs at so critical a moment being left in the hands of Malmesbury, says that we, the opposition, are not only justified but called upon by the challenge in the Queen's speech on the dissolution, to test the strength of parties, but that he is himself in a different position, that he would vote a condemnation of the dissolution, but hesitates as to no confidence. Sir Robert Phillimore, 387, gives us other glimpses during this month. May 18. Long interview with Gladstone. He entered most fully and without any reserve into his views on the state of political parties and on the duties of a statesman at this juncture. Thought the only chance of a strong government was an engrafting of Palmerston upon Lord Derby, dethroning Disraeli from the leadership of the House of Commons, arranging for a moderate reform bill, placing the Foreign Office in other hands, but not in Disraeli's. He dwelt much upon this. Foreign politics seemed to have the chief place in his mind. May 31. Gladstone has seen Palmerston, and said he will not vote against Lord Derby in support of Lord John's supposed motion. The government Gladstone thinks desirable is a fusion of Palmerston and his followers with Lord Derby, which implies, of course, weeding out half at least of the present cabinet. Gladstone will have to vote with government and speak against the cabinet, and violently he will be abused. June 1. Dined with Gladstone. He is much harassed and distressed at his position relative to the government and opposition. Spoke strongly against Lord Malmesbury. Said if the proposal is to censure the dissolution, he must agree with it, but he will vote against a want of confidence. One important personage was quite confident that Gladstone would vote the government out. Another thought that he would be sure to join a Liberal administration. Palmerston believed this too, even though he might not vote for a motion of want of confidence. Clarendon expected Gladstone to join, though he would rather see him at the Foreign Office than at the Exchequer. At a dinner party at Lord Carlisle's where Palmerston, Lord John, Granville, Clarendon, Lewis, Argyle, and Delane were present, Sir Charles Wood in a conversation with Mrs. Gladstone found her much less inclined to keep the Derby government in. In the last week of May a party feast was planned by Lord Palmerston and the Whip, but Lord John Russell declined to join the dinner. It was decided to call a meeting of the party. A confidential visitor was talking of it at Cambridge House, when the brougham came to the door to take Palmerston down to Pembroke Lodge. He was going, he said, to ask Lord John what they should say if they were asked at the meeting whether they had come to an agreement. The interview was not unsatisfactory. 4 days later, June 6, a well-attended meeting of the party was held at Willis's rooms. The two protagonists declared themselves ready to aid in forming a government on a broad basis, and it was understood that either would serve under the other. It would be for the sovereign to decide. Mr. Bright spoke in what the Whigs pronounced to be a highly reasonable vein, and they all broke up in great spirits. The wit pored over his lists, and made out that they could not beat the government by less than 7. This was but a slender margin for a vote of no confidence, but it was felt that mere numbers, though a majority might be an indispensable incident, were in this case not the only test of the conditions required for a solid government. Lord Hartington, the representative of the great House of Cavendish, was put up to move a vote of no confidence, 388. Fall of the Derby government. After 3 days' debate, ministers were defeated, June 11, by the narrow figure of 13 in a House of 637. Mr. Gladstone did not speak, but he answered the riddle that had for long so much harassed the wirepullers, by going into the lobby with Disraeli and his flock. The general sense of the majority was probably best expressed by Mr. Bright. Since the fall of the government of Sir Robert Peel, he said, there had been no good handling of the Liberal party in the House, the cabinet had been exclusive, the policy had been sometimes wholly wrong, and generally feeble and paltering,
if in the new government there should be found men adequately representing these reconciled sections, acting with some measure of boldness and power, grappling with the abuses that were admitted to exist, and relying upon the moral sense and honest feeling of the House, and the general sympathy of the people of England for improvement in our legislation, he was bold to hope that the new government would have a longer tenure of office than any government that had existed for many years past. The Queen, in the embarrassment of a choice between the two Whig veterans, induced Lord Granville, whose cabinet life as yet was only some 5 years, to try to form a government. This step Palmerston explained by her German sympathies, which made her adverse alike to Lord John and himself. Lord Granville first applied to Palmerston, who said that the Queen ought to have sent for himself first, still he agreed to serve. Lord John would only serve under Granville on condition of being leader in the House of Commons, if he joined, so he argued, and if Palmerston were leader in the Commons, this would make himself third instead of second. On that point his answer was final. So Lord Granville threw up a commission that never had life in it, the Queen handed the task over to Palmerston, and in a few days the new administration was installed.
June 17, 1859. 2.
Mr. Gladstone went back to the office that he had quitted 4 years and a half before, and undertook the Department of Finance.
The appointment did not pass without considerable remark.
The real scandal, he wrote to his Oxford chairman, is among the extreme men on the Liberal side. They naturally say, this man has done all he could on behalf of Lord Derby, why is he here to keep out one of us? Even some among Mr. Gladstone's private friends wondered how he could bring himself to join a minister of whom he had for 3 or 4 years used such unsparing language as had been common on his lips about Lord Palmerston. The plain man was puzzled by a vote in favour of keeping a Tory government in, followed by a junction with the men who had thrown that government out. Cobden, as we know, declined to join. 389, I am exceedingly sorry, wrote Mr. Gladstone to his brother Robertson, July 2, to find that Cobden does not take office. It was in his person that there seemed to be the best chance of a favourable trial of the experiment of connecting his friends with the practical administration of the government of this country. I am very glad we have Gibson, but Cobden would, especially as an addition to the former, have made a great difference in point of weight.
390. Again at the Exchequer.
Mr. Gladstone, with no special anxiety to defend himself, was clear about his own course. Never, he says, had I an easier question to determine than when I was asked to join the government. I can hardly now think how I could have looked anyone in the face, had I refused my aid, such as it is, at such a time and under such circumstances. At a moment, he wrote to the Warden of All Souls, when war is raging in Europe, when the English government is the only instrument through which there is any hope, humanly speaking, of any safe and early settlement, and when all parties agree that the government of the Queen ought to be strengthened, I have joined the only administration that could be formed, in concert with all the friends, setting aside those whom age excludes, with whom I joined and acted in the government of Lord
Aberdeen.
To the Provost of Oriel he addressed a rather elaborate explanation, 391, but it only expands what he says more briefly in a letter, June 16, to Sir William Heathcote, an excellent and honourable man, his colleague in the representation of Oxford.
I am so little sensible of having had any very doubtful point to consider, that I feel confident that, given the antecedents of the problem as they clearly stood before me, you would have decided in the way that I have done. For 13 years, the middle space of life, I have been cast out of party connection, severed from my old party, and loath irrecoverably to join a new one. So long have I adhered to the vague hope of a reconstruction, that I have been left alone by every political friend and association with whom I had grown up. My votes too, and such support as I could give, have practically been given to Lord Derby's government, in such a manner as undoubtedly to divest me of all claims whatever on the Liberal party and the incoming government. Under these circumstances I am asked to take office.
The two leading points which must determine immediate action are those of reform and foreign policy. On the first I think that Lord Derby had by dissolution lost all chance of settling it, and, as I desire to see it settled, it seems my duty to assist those who perhaps may settle it. Upon the second, I am in real and close harmony of sentiment with the new Premier and the new Foreign Secretary. How could I, under these circumstances, say, I will have nothing to do with you, and be the one remaining Ishmael in the House of Commons? Writing to Sir John Acton in 1864, Mr. Gladstone said, "When I took my present office in 1859, I had several negative and several positive reasons for accepting it. Of the first, there were these. There had been differences and collisions, but there were no resentments. I felt myself to be mischievous in an isolated position, outside the regular party organization of Parliament. And I was aware of no differences of opinion or tendency likely to disturb the new government. Then, on the positive side, I felt sure that in finance there was still much useful work to be done. I was desirous to cooperate in settling the question of the franchise, and failed to anticipate the disaster that it was to undergo. My friends were enlisted, or I knew would enlist, Sir James Graham indeed declining office, but taking his position in the party. And the overwhelming interest and weight of the Italian question, and of our foreign policy in connection with it, joined to my entire mistrust of the former government in relation to it, led me to decide without one moment's hesitation." Contest at Oxford. On the day on which Mr. Gladstone kissed hands, June 18, disturbing news came from Oxford. Not only was his re-election to be opposed, but the enemy had secured the most formidable candidate that he had yet encountered, in the person of Lord Chandos, the eldest son of the Duke of Buckingham. His old chairman became chairman for his new antagonist, and Stafford Northcote, who with Phillimore and Bernard had hitherto fought every election on his behalf, now refused to serve on his committee, while even Sir John Coleridge was alarmed at some reported wavering on the question of a deceased wife's sister. Gladstone, angry, harassed, sore, Phillimore records, as well he might be. The provost of Oriel explains to him that men asked whether his very last vote had not been a vote of confidence in a Derby government, and of want of confidence in a Palmerston government, yet he had joined the government in which he declared by anticipation that he had no confidence. After all, the root of the anger against him was simply that the Tories were out and the Liberals in, with himself as their strongest confederate. A question was raised whether he ought not to go down and address convocation in person. The Dean of Christ Church, however, thought it very doubtful whether he would get a hearing. Those, he told Mr. Gladstone, who remember Sir Robert Peel's election, testified that there never was a more unreasonable and ferocious mob than Convocation was at that time. If you were heard, it is doubtful whether you would gain any votes at that last moment, while it is believed you would lose some. You would be questioned as to the ecclesiastical policy of the cabinet. Either you would not be able to answer fully, or you would answer in such terms as to alienate one or other of the too numerous classes who will now give you many votes. The usual waterspout began to pour. The newspapers asserted that Mr. Gladstone meant to cut down naval estimates, and this moved the country clergy to angry apprehension that he was for peace at any price. The candidate was obliged to spend thankless hours on letters to reassure them. The two assertions of fact respecting me are wholly unfounded. I mean these two: 1. That as Chancellor of the Exchequer I starved the Crimean War, that is to say limited the expenditure upon it. There is not a shadow of truth in this statement. 2. That as soon as the war was over I caused the government to reduce their estimates, diminish the army, disband 2 fleets, and break faith with our seamen. When the war was over, that is in the year 1856, I did not take objection at all to the establishment or expenditure of the year. In the next year, 1857, I considered that they ought to have been further reduced, but neither a man nor a shilling was taken from them in consequence of my endeavors. Other correspondents were uneasy about his soundness on rifle corps and rifle clubs. How, he replied, can any uncertainty exist as to the intentions in regard to defense in a government with Lord Palmerston at its head? He was warned that Cobden, Bright, and Gibson were odious in Oxford, and he was suspected of being their accomplice. The clamour against Puseyism had died down, and the hostility of the evangelicals was no longer keen, otherwise it was the old story. Goldwin Smith tells him, "Win or lose, you will have the vote of everyone of heart and brain in the university and really connected with it.
Young Oxford is all with you.
Every year more men obtain the reward of their industry through your legislation. But old Oxford takes a long time in dying." In the end, July 1st, he won the battle by a majority of 191, Gladstone, 1050, Chandos, 859. "My conscience is light and clear," he wrote to Heathcote in the course of the contest. "The interests that have weighed with me are in some degree peculiar, and I dare say it is a fault in me, especially as member for Oxford, that I cannot merge the man in the representative. While they have had much reason to complain, I have not had an overgood bargain. In the estimate of mere pleasure and pain, the representation of the university is not worth my having, for though the account is long on both sides, the latter is the heavier and sharper. In the true estimates of good and evil, I can look back upon the last 12 years with some satisfaction, first, because I feel that as far as I am capable of laboring for anything, I have labored for Oxford, and secondly, because in this respect at least I have been happy that the times afforded me in various ways a field. And even as to the contemptible summing up between suffering and enjoyment, my belief is that the latter will endure, while the former will pass away." The balance struck in this last sentence is a characteristic fragment of Mr. Gladstone's philosophy of public life. It lightened and dispelled the inevitable hours of disappointment and chagrin that, in natures of less lofty fortitude than his, are apt to slacken the nerve and rust the sword.
3. Party severance, not changed principles.
It seems a mistake to treat the acceptance of office under Lord Palmerston as a chief landmark in Mr. Gladstone's protracted journey from Tory to Liberal.
The dilemma between joining Derby and joining Palmerston was no vital choice between two political creeds.
The new Prime Minister and his Chancellor of the Exchequer had both of them started with Canning for their common master, but there was a generation between them, and Mr. Gladstone had travelled along a road of his own, perhaps not even now perceiving its goal. As we have seen, he told Mr. Walpole in May 1858, page 584, that there were no broad and palpable differences of opinion on public questions of principle that separated himself from the Derbyite Tories. 392. Palmerston, on the other hand, was so much of a Derbyite Tory that his government, which Mr. Gladstone was now entering, owed its long spell of office and power to the countenance of Derby and his men. Mr. Bright had contemplated, page 579, the possibility of a reverse process, a Derbyite government favored by Palmerston's men. In either case, the political identity of the two leaders was recognized. To join the new administration, then, marked a party severance but no changed principles. I am far from denying the enormous significance of the party wrench, but it was not a conversion. Mr. Gladstone was at this time in his politics a liberal reformer of Turgot's type, a born lover of good government, of just practical laws, of wise improvement, of public business well handled, of a state that should emancipate and serve the individual. The necessity of summoning new driving force, and amending the machinery of the Constitution, had not yet disclosed itself to him. This was soon discovered by events. Meanwhile, he may well have thought that he saw as good a chance of great work with Palmerston as with Disraeli, or far better, for the election had shown that Bright was not wrong when he warned him that a Derby government could only exist upon forbearance. Bright's own words already referred to, page 625, sufficiently describe Mr. Gladstone's point of view: the need for a ministry with men in it acting with some measure of boldness and power, grappling with abuses, and relying upon the moral sense and honest feeling of the House, and the general sympathy of the people of England for improvement. With such purposes, an alliance with Liberals of Lord Palmerston's temper implied no wonderful dislodgement. The really great dislodgement in his life had occurred long before. It was the fates that befell his book, it was the Maynooth grant, and the Gorham case, that swept away the foundations on which he had first built. In writing to Manning in 1845, April 25, after his retirement on the question of Maynooth, Mr. Gladstone says to him, "Newman sent me a letter giving his own explanation of my position. It was admirably done." Newman in his letter told him that various persons had asked how he understood Mr. Gladstone's present position, So he put down what he conceived it to be, and he expresses the great interest that he feels in the tone of thought then engaging the statesman's mind.
Letter from Newman.
I say then, writes Newman, addressing an imaginary interlocutor, Mr. Gladstone has said the state ought to have a conscience, but it has not a conscience.
Can he give it a conscience? Is he to impose his own conscience on the state?
He would be very glad to do so, if it thereby would become the state's conscience.
But that is absurd. He must deal with facts.
It has 1,000 consciences, as being in its legislative and executive capacities the aggregate of 100 minds, that is, it has no conscience. You will say, well, the obvious thing would be, if the state has not a conscience, that he shall cease to be answerable for it.
So he has retired from the ministry.
While he thought he could believe it had a conscience, till he was forced to give up, what it was his duty to cherish as long as ever he could, the notion that the British Empire was a subject and servant of the kingdom of Christ, he served the state. Now that he finds this to be a mere dream, much as it ought to be otherwise, and as it once was otherwise, he has said, I cannot serve such a mistress.
But really, I continue, do you in your heart mean to say that he should absolutely and forever give up the state and country? I hope not.
I do not think he has so committed himself. That the conclusion he has come to is a very grave one, and not consistent with his going on blindly in the din and hurry of business, without having principles to guide him, I admit, and this, I conceive, is his reason for at once retiring from the ministry, that he may contemplate the state of things calmly and from without. But I really cannot pronounce, nor can you, nor can he perhaps at once, what is a Christian's duty under these new circumstances, whether to remain in retirement from public affairs or not. Retirement, however, could not be done by halves. If he is absolutely to give up all management of public affairs, he must retire not only from the ministry but from Parliament. I see another reason for his retiring from the ministry. The public thought they had in his book a pledge that the government would not take such a step with regard to Maynooth as is now before the country. Had he continued in the ministry, he would to a certain extent have been misleading the country. You say, he made some show of seeing his way in future, for he gave advice. He said it would be well for all parties to yield something. To see his way and to give advice is as if he had found some principle to go on.
I do not so understand him.
I thought he distinctly stated he had not yet found a principle. But he gave that advice which facts, or what he called circumstances, made necessary, and which have followed out, will, it is to be hoped, lead to some basis of principle which we do not see at present. Compared to the supreme case of conscience indicated here, and it haunted Mr. Gladstone for nearly all his life, the perplexities of party could be but secondary. Those perplexities were never sharper than in the 4 years from 1854 to 1859, and with his living sense of responsibility for the right use of transcendent powers of national service, it was practically inevitable that he should at last quit the barren position of the one remaining Ishmael in the House of Commons.
4.
Later in this year Mr. Gladstone was chosen to be the first Lord Rector of the University of Edinburgh under powers conferred by a recent law.
His unsuccessful rival was Lord Neaves, excellent as lawyer, humorist, and scholar.
In April the following year, in the midst of the most trying session of his life, he went down from the battleground at Westminster, and delivered his rectorial address, 393, not particularly pregnant, original, or pithy, but marked by incomparable buoyancy, enforcing a conception of the proper functions of a university that can never be enforced too strongly or too often, and impressing in melodious period and glowing image those ever-needed commonplaces about thrift of time and thirst for
fame and the glory of knowledge, that kindle sacred fire in young hearts.
It was his own career, intellectual as well as political, that gave to his discourse momentum. It was his own example that to youthful hearers gave new depth to a trite lesson, when he exclaimed, "Believe me when I tell you that the thrift of time will repay you in after life with an usury of profit beyond your most sanguine dreams, and that the waste of it will make you dwindle, alike in intellectual and in moral stature, beneath your darkest reckonings." So too, we who have it all before us know that it was a maxim of his own inner life, when he told them, The thirst for an enduring fame is near akin to the love of true excellence, but the fame of the moment is a dangerous possession and a bastard motive, and he who does his acts in order that the echo of them may come back as a soft music in his ears, plays false to his noble destiny as a Christian man, places himself in continual danger of dallying with wrong, and taints even his virtuous
actions at their source.
Footnotes 387, not, however, Sir Robert until 1862, when he was knighted on becoming Queen's Advocate.
He was created baronet in 1881.
388. Lord Hartington's motion was that it is essential for the satisfactory result of our deliberations, and for facilitating the discharge of Your Majesty's high functions, that Your Majesty's government should possess the confidence of this House and of the country, and we deem it our duty respectfully to submit to Your Majesty that such confidence is not reposed in the present advisers of Your Majesty.
389. Life of Cobden, 2. Pages 229 to 233.
390. There is a strange story in the Halifax papers of Bright at this time visiting Lord Aberdeen, and displaying much ill humor.
He cannot reconcile himself to not being considered capable of taking office.
Lord John broached a scheme for sending him as Governor-General to Canada. I rather doubted the expediency of this, but Mr. Gladstone seemed to think it not a bad scheme. June 15, 1859. Many curious things sprang up in men's minds at that moment. 391, reproduced in Mr. Russell's book on Mr. Gladstone, pages 144 to 5. 392. It is worth noticing that he sat on the ministerial side of the House without breach of continuity from 1853 to 1866. During the first Derby government, as we have already seen, page 423, he sat below the gangway on the opposition side. During the Palmerston administration of 1855 he sat below the gangway on the government side, and he remained there after the second Derby accession to office in 1858.
393. The address is in Gleanings, 7.